These are going to be notes covering macromolecules, so we've been talking about them in class, and carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Today we are going to be talking about carbohydrates and proteins, and we'll do lipids and nucleic acids on a different day. Just a reminder that that word macro means big. Nothing really to write on this side, just an explanation of why we are still doing chemistry. It's important that you know what's in your food and in your bodies and the chemicals that your body needs to survive and to be healthy. And then the reverse of that, what chemicals could be harmful to organisms, not just humans, but other organisms as well. And so learning the basic structure of our bodies and our cells and how they metabolize and handle these different types of macromolecules is essential to maintaining a good and healthy body. So again, nothing to write on this slide, but we know that the four macromolecules are carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids. And like I said, we're going to look at carbohydrates. Whoops. We're going to look at carbohydrates and proteins today. And then we'll focus on nucleic acids and lipids on the next slides, or the next notes. Some information for you to write down if you don't have it already in other notes is that all macromolecules contain carbon. And it's the fact that they contain carbon is what makes them organic molecules. So if you don't know that or you don't have that written somewhere down in your notes already, you need to make sure that you include that in the notes today. There's covalent bonds that link them together. You do not need to write that down. All living organisms are composed of the four main classes of macromolecules. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Each class is made up of a subunit. We're going to look at those. The large compound is made by joining smaller ones together, and this process is called polymerization. This might be something that you should write down. So we talked about polymerization by condensation reactions in class when we first did our reading over this section, but this is just a review. So a monomer plus a monomer equals a polymer. And so what a condensation reaction is the removal of this water molecule from these two monomers. So this is monomer and this is a monomer. And so if you remove this water molecule, and so the water gets kicked out, then that leaves these bonds open to join up. And this is a polymerization because you're making a polymer. And the type of reaction is called a condensation reaction. So vocabulary words you need to know. Condensation reactions are the removal of water from two separate monomers, and then when those monomers come together to form one polymer, that process is polymerization. A good chart for you to write down. It's a nice, neat organization of this information. So the carbohydrate monomer is a saccharide. The polymer is a polysaccharide. And some examples would be some simple carbs, which would be like candy, or some complex carbs, which would be like starches. Okay, so those are two common examples of carbohydrates. And then it has a monomer and the polymer. For a protein, the monomer is amino acid. The polymer, we've been calling it protein, and that's okay, but it's technically called a polypeptide. And then there's lots of different examples of proteins. Remember that proteins are the main structural component of our bodies. And so enzymes, hormones, muscles, tissues, any combination of those that you want to write down as well. But this is a good chart. I would take the time to write this down in my notes. This is an important slide for carbohydrates, so I would take the time to write this down as well. This is the main information that you need to know. Carbohydrates are our primary source of energy. The elements that are in a carbohydrate, the elements that are in carbohydrates are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. You need to know that. And they occur in this 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, meaning that for every 1 carbon, there's 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. So if we look at this glucose example, we have 6 carbons, which means we have 12 hydrogens and 6 oxygens. So that's that 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. This is glucose. That's the chemical formula for glucose. The monomer of a carbohydrate is called a saccharide. If you don't feel like you need to write that again, then you don't have to. Polymers are called polysaccharides. The words ending in "ose" are going to be our carbohydrates. So this OSE ending, we've talked about that in class. And then I just added this in here. The disaccharide is 2 monomers bonded together. This is the only group of macromolecules that has that in-between state of a monomer and a polymer. And so a disaccharide is just 2 monomers that are bonded together. So this is a slide dealing with just saccharides, which would be the monomer of the carbohydrates. They're going to have a 6-carbon ring, and so the next slide shows you that in a chemical example, but a 6-carbon ring looks like this. And so each one of these points is represented a carbon. And so there's 6 carbons in a ring, and that's their chemical structure. They're often referred to as simple sugars, and this would be your kind of instantaneous energy, your soda, your candy, or your fruit. And notice that they all end in OSE, sucrose, glucose, fructose, lactose. And these are dissolvable in water. So as far as writing things down on this slide, you need to know that simple sugars give you that instantaneous energy. So this slide gives you a good visual of those carbon rings. So you'll notice there's a carbon here, there's a carbon here, and a carbon here, and a carbon here, and a carbon here. And so these carbon rings, that's the chemical formula. That's how they come together and bond chemically. And so these are just some examples of those monosaccharides in their chemical state. So nothing for you to write down on this slide. You should know that sucrose is table sugar. That should be in your notes somewhere. It is a very common disaccharide. This is your example of the disaccharide, and so you can see that you have monomer 1 and then monomer 2, and they bond together to form a disaccharide. But you should know that sucrose is your table sugar. Nothing to write on this slide. Again, just giving you some more visuals of what disaccharides look like. And so you can see these carbon rings. Lactose and maltose are also disaccharides, but nothing for you to write on this slide, just giving you a visual. This is going through that condensation reaction or dehydration synthesis. So these are vocabulary words that you need to know. Condensation reaction, dehydration synthesis, they are equal to each other. Both of them mean the removal of water, and so if you look here, you have an OH molecule and a hydrogen, and those are going to get removed and form this water molecule, and then bond, what's left is going to bond together to form this disaccharide. So this whole process is known as polymerization, and it's done by a condensation reaction or a dehydration synthesis. Both vocabulary words that you need to know. And so what they mean is the removal of water and the formation of a polymer. So for these polysaccharides, you need to know that poly means many sugars and saccharides, and they add together to make a more complex carbohydrates. So these will be your grains, your pastas, your rices. They are more of a stored energy source than an instantaneous energy source because they do not dissolve in water. Our simple sugars, our candies and our fruits are dissolvable in water and therefore easier for our body to get that energy, extract that energy out of. These polysaccharides are not dissolvable in water, and therefore it takes time for that energy to get released. And so they are a stored energy source, and so not quite as long-term as a lipid, but not an instantaneous energy source. You need to know this. I added this in right here. So you need to know the 3 common polysaccharides are starch, glycogen, and cellulose. And so starch is found in grains, glycogen is found in animals, and cellulose is found in plants. So you need to know those 3 polysaccharides, and that a polysaccharide is a complex carbohydrate. So this is just an example of a polysaccharide. This one is starch, known as amylose. It's made up of long chains of saccharides. So one molecule of amylose can contain thousands of glucose molecules. So it's just repeating over and over and over again. nothing for you to write on this slide, just giving you a visual of what this polysaccharide looks like. And so I've talked about a paper clip chain as an example. And so this is why I do that, because it looks like it, right? So this would be a single paper clip, okay? And then the whole thing together is your chain of paper clips, your polymer. So this is another example of starch, and again, you can see that they chain together to form these polymers. Okay, so these big chains are the polymers, and the individual units would be considered the monomers, and they all form through condensation reactions in the process of polymerization. This is glycogen. You can see that as glycogen is really highly branched, it's big, and it's what's stored in your muscles and your liver. So each ring is one glucose molecule. So each one of these little dots is a glucose molecule. And so you can see how they all come together. Those monosaccharides come together to form this huge polysaccharide. So cellulose, this is an example of cellulose. Again, notice that OSE ending. Okay, that's going to be your key to knowing that it's a carbohydrate. This is cellulose, it's fiber. Okay, so your greens, your leafy greens are going to be made up of cellulose. They're non-digestible. And so in plants, it provides structure to them. And in humans, it provides bulk in our digestive tract. This is your summary page. If you don't have this information written down, you should, but write it down now. But most of you should have this already in your notes, so there shouldn't be much more for you to write down on this page. So carbohydrates are a main source of energy. It can be quick and it can be stored. So quick would be your monosaccharides and stored would be your polysaccharides. Living organisms store extra sugar as complex structure called starch. Animal starch is referred to as glycogen. The basic unit or monomer is called a monosaccharide. Di means that there's two monosaccharides bonded together with that water being kicked out and that condensation or dehydration synthesis. And poly means mini saccharides. Again, they are formed with that water being kicked out during that process of polymerization. Absolutely nothing for you to write on this page, just giving you some visuals of carbohydrates in real life and not in chemical pictures. So moving on to proteins. Proteins, in addition to having carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, also have nitrogen. So you need to know that proteins contain nitrogen, as well as carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. We already know that the monomers of proteins are amino acids. We wrote that down in the chart in the carbohydrate section. There are 20 amino acids. In humans, 8 of these 20 amino acids are considered to be essential, and they combine in different ways to make a variety of protein structures. It's the shape of the protein that gives them their function. So you should write that down. Shape equals function. As we know, proteins take up many different roles, so they can act as enzymes. So you need to have proteins are enzymes. You need to know that some are used to form the structural components of organisms like bones, muscles, and tissues. And others are transport proteins. And those are in our bodies, and they are hormones or antibodies, and they can help transport substances in and out of our cells. So many different roles for proteins, and you need to know them. On this page, we already wrote down that function is determined by the shape of the protein. And so that's really all you need to know. The rest of this is pretty complex for us. But there's 4 levels of organization. It's the sequence of the amino acids. It can be twisted or folded, or it can be a chain. Again, you just need to know that the shape is what determines the function of the protein. So this is the basic structure of an amino acid. Obviously, this is an animated view of it. You'll notice the carbon, which makes it organic. We have our nitrogen, which is now present, and then oxygen and hydrogen. It's this side group that's important in proteins. This is what's called the R group, and it's the part that changes, and that's what makes the 20 amino acids different. So the R group is what's important. Okay, so R group makes them different. So R group is the part that changes and makes one amino acid different from another. You do not need to know or memorize these. This is a list of the amino acids that can be made in the body. And then the 8 that are essential for amino acids is this INE ending that is kind of a telltale sign that it's an amino acid versus the OSE, the OS in carbohydrates, the INE in amino acids. But again, you do not need to memorize them, you do not need to know them, but just giving you a list of them and what they are, so they are more than just random things that we talk about. We have talked a lot about enzymes in class. We've talked about a lot of them on our notes, and so if you don't feel like you need to write this, don't by all means, but if you don't understand what an enzyme is, you should write this down. Cells use enzyme to speed up chemical reactions that take place in the cells. They are very specific. That's a key part. They only work on one type of chemical reaction. They cannot work on every type of chemical reaction. Work very much like a lock and key. Okay, one key for one lock. You can do it over and over again, but it's only going to unlock that one key. Enzymes are only going to do that one chemical reaction. They end in ASE, okay, lactase, protease, lipase, and like I said, they're very specific to the type of chemical reaction that they can catalyze. This is just to give you a visual of the different shapes of protein. So each one of these boxes is a different protein, and so you can see how they can take on so many different shapes. And again, it's that shape that makes their function or determines their function. On this slide, you don't need to write anything down, but this is just an example of enzymes working in your body. And so your body produces carbon dioxide that is carried by your blood to your lungs when exhaled. This reaction would not occur quickly enough without enzymes. And so you would basically have carbon dioxide poisoning if you didn't have that enzyme there to remove it from your blood to your lungs quickly. So this is just a picture to give you a visual of the different types of tissues that are formed from proteins. So you have your blood, nervous tissue, your loose connective tissue, your smooth muscle tissue, all different types of proteins. Another example of protein is hemoglobin. You should write that down. That's something that might come up as we talk about this or on a worksheet. You need to know that hemoglobin is a type of protein, and the function of hemoglobin is to carry the oxygen throughout the body. It's found in the red blood cells, and the oxygen binds to the hemoglobin and gets transported throughout our bodies. Antibodies are another type of proteins. You should write that down. Antibodies are large Y-shaped proteins that are used in the immune system to identify and neutralize foreign objects. You need to know that antibodies help our bodies fight bacteria and viruses. And they attach to them. And this next slide shows you how they do that. Just kidding, this is a silly cartoon. So this is the antibody right here. And the antibody, what it does is it connects to the antigen on a virus. And so you can see how this piece would fit in here. And so that's the comic on antibodies. But this slide shows you more what happens. And so up here you have extracellular microbes, so bacteria, different viruses. And so if you get an infection, this is what your body does to fight it. And so you can see that your body's lymphocytes have these Y-shaped structures on them. Those are the antibodies. And they will attach themselves to the body's, to the whatever it is that's invading your body, the bacteria. And so you can see that they've now attached themselves to those bacteria and different microbes that could make you sick. And then get engulfed by a cell and then removed from your body. And so that's how your immune system works. Um, this is another way that your immune system works. This is cellular immunity, in which the whole cell needs to be destroyed. And so you can see, you've heard of T cells probably before. And so you need to have a certain amount of T cells in your body in order to fight off a bad cell. So this would right here would be a bad cell or an infected cell that might have a virus in it. And so the T cell will come and basically end up destroying this infected cell. Hormones are another type of protein. You should write that down if you don't have it already. But they are chemicals that are made in one part of the body and affect another. And so we've all talked about growth hormones, or we've heard about growth hormones, and growth hormones are made in the brain, in the pituitary gland, and obviously affect the rest of our bodies. Insulin's made in the pancreas, but then goes on and affects other parts of our bodies as well. So different hormones, but all hormones are proteins. This is your protein summary. You do not need to write it down unless you've missed something along the way. So amino acids are the monomers, which would be the building blocks. The proteins have many functions based upon their shape. Some functions are structural, like muscles and tissues. This is typically what we eat. Okay, so we tend to consume these. Other types of proteins function as enzymes. And then, another type of protein would be an antibody or a hormone. So what I'd like for you to do now is to take a piece of paper, or if you have note cards, that's fine too, but to make some flashcards with these vocabulary words. So these are the list of vocabulary words that I need for you to write flashcards for. So on one side you write the word, and then on the other side you write the definition.